What's up folks, Nate here at Two Wheel Dyno Works. Today we are on the dyno with our brand new 2025 Honda Rebel 1100. And I've actually been working on this bike for the last week or so now, going through all of our mapping development, working out a couple kinks in the software while we were at it. So we're already quite a ways through our tuning development for this bike. I've actually already finished our mapping for the stock exhaust, for the slip-on. We went with the Vance & Hines here, and I'm not really sure I'm in love with this thing with how long it is, so I'll probably swap that out later and do some more videos showing other options. But we've also even finished up our mapping for the Black Widow header that you can see we have installed there. And we've even done some intake testing already. But before we dive into the intake and exhaust specific modification and testing that we've done, we first need to talk about the bike's bone stock performance. Because honestly, that rather lackluster performance is why so many people email us every single week requesting tuning for these bikes. And after a couple years of just saying no, we finally got sick of that and decided to buy our own to go through all of this intake testing and tuning, and to also smooth out all the other issues in the stock ECU mapping on these bikes. Because there's a lot of them. So without further ado, let's just dive right in. This is our bike in 100% bone stock configuration on our dyno. When we were done breaking it in, it made 76.7 horsepower and 67 pound-feet of torque to the tire on pump gas. And as you can see here, we can't even hit 6,500 RPM in fifth gear where we're measuring horsepower and torque to the tire on these bikes because there's a 99 mile an hour speed limit in place. Now, there's speed limiters on pretty much every modern motorcycle on the market these days, but I've never seen one that's all the way down at 99 mile an hour on any of the bikes that we've purchased to develop tuning for. So this one kind of shocked me. Because not only can you not run out fifth gear, you can't even run out fourth gear, which is what we're looking at right now. You can even see how screwed up the fueling is down here off the bottom. This is super lean and why the power curve's so wavy there. But in fourth, we can still only get it out to about 7,500 RPM. And the OEM rev limit on this bike is 8,300. In fact, when I was doing our gear-specific testing, I found that you can't even run these bikes out bone stock until you're all the way back down into third gear. Which is exactly what you're looking at here with this really screwed up power curve and this hilariously lean fueling below 5,500 RPM. Now, the speed limiter was annoying when I was riding this bike around, but truly what I found the most frustrating about riding this thing was how twitchy the throttle was. And it is mostly due to the fact that the fuel mapping in these ECUs and controlled by the terrible narrowband O2 sensor on these bikes has this thing running atrociously lean down low. But in this case, down low is pretty much the bottom 2/3 of the rev range because it doesn't finally start to clean up until above 5,500 RPM. And you're just not there all the time on these bikes. Certainly not where you're just cruising around going down the road. So that was the very first thing we tackled with the bike in bone stock trim, along with obviously removing the speed limiter. So if we compare fifth gear to fifth gear here, red being the bike in bone stock trim, and blue being with the stock exhaust and intake still in place, with our custom ECU mapping now in the ECU, you can see that you gain a lot of usable revs, and that is really going to be present in fourth, fifth, and sixth gear, where previously you couldn't even run these things out. With the fueling sorted out, we also do gain at wide open throttle a little bit of power and torque here from like 2,500 pretty much all the way through the rest of the rev range. But honestly, that's not really what's going to change your life, having us tune this bike for you. Because again, at wide open throttle, yeah, there's a little bit of performance to be had, but it's all of the part throttle manners that are so dramatically smoothed out with our custom fuel mapping in place, and what we've done and overhauled with the throttle-by-wire maps and the ignition timing curves. Now, as we've come to expect in modern Euro 5 and Euro 5 Plus emissions-compliant ECUs, at least in the motorcycle industry, the ignition timing advance maps in this bike are terrible. They are massively over-advanced in some portions of the rev range to provide a nice crisp and clean burn, which also makes the throttle even twitchier than it really needs to be. But in some portions of the mapping, it's also massively retarded, meaning the ignition timing advance is not nearly as high as it needs to be or could be, so we've completely overhauled those maps, and it provides also a much smoother and stronger throttle response throughout the entirety of the rev range. And the last thing I went ahead and tackled to go ahead and smooth out some of that on-off throttle transition and the initial throttle response is I went through every single throttle-by-wire table in these ECUs and smoothed them out. They weren't terrible from the factory, but they weren't great. And it takes a long time to go through every single throttle-by-wire map on these new Honda ECUs because there is a separate map for every gear, every power mode, and every engine braking mode. So when you add them all up, there's well over 100 throttle-by-wire tables, but I went through and smoothed out every single one of them, so no matter what mode you're in now, it will just feel smoother and stronger simultaneously when you're rolling on the throttle, but not nearly as abrupt and herky-jerky as it was in bone stock trim when you're rolling off and just trying to get back on. So now that we've covered all of that, let's talk about what we've done to this bike to try to uncork some additional performance. While we were actually waiting for the exhaust components to arrive, we first got an aftermarket air filter from K&N to go ahead and see if the stock filter even poses a restriction just right off the bat. Normally when I'm doing intake and exhaust specific testing and tuning on bikes that we buy here at the shop, I usually go through the exhaust system first. But in this case, we decided to start with the airbox, pop that K&N race filter in there, and guess what? We gained nothing. 0 horsepower. There was not a tenth of a pony to be gained or a tenth of a pound-foot of torque by replacing the OEM air filter. So just right off the bat, discount that modification. Don't waste your time and money. So the very next thing we did was ditch the stock muffler and install this pipe from Vance & Hines. Now, it does provide some performance improvement, but I'm just not really that thrilled with the fitment of it. It kind of sits at this weird downward angle instead of being like straight here. And it's really, really long. This actually sticks back past the rear tire, which on this bike doesn't look great. So we'll talk about the performance that this does provide, because honestly, just about every slip-on is going to provide the same performance by getting rid of the restriction the stock muffler poses. But I don't think I'll be leaving that one on the bike for very long. So with the Vance & Hines slip-on installed, here's what we were able to accomplish in terms of performance improvement. Output now is up to 83 horsepower, and torque really didn't change. Peak torque occurs right there around 4,500-ish or so, and you're just kind of at the same spot, because honestly, the muffler isn't really a restriction there, the header is. We'll get to that in just a second. You do still gain right here off the bottom, which is nice, and up through till about 4,500 RPM, and then above 6,000 RPM, there's obviously some significant gains where you're picking up 3 ponies out there at peak power. So overall, yes, definitely put slip-ons on these bikes. But if you're going to do so, you absolutely should be having someone like us here at Two Wheel Dyno Works flash the ECU, because the fueling goes even leaner than it was already in stock trim in a lot of the light throttle portions of the rev range, and the stock fuel mapping and those garbage narrowband O2 sensors that come on these modern bikes just cannot accommodate for that airflow change. So if you're even going to do something as basic as a slip-on on this bike, I highly recommend that you go ahead and have someone like us flash the ECU, because even with just a slip-on installed, there's some portions of the fuel mapping, because of how lean and screwed up it is right out of the factory, where we're adding 25% more fuel than is in those stock fuel maps. And that is a ton of extra fuel. Now the next modification, and the last physical one I've made to the bike as of the time I'm shooting this video, is the header here from Black Widow. It did not take me very long to realize how much of a restriction the header posed on this bike, so I immediately went ahead and ordered one from the guys over at Black Widow. It only took a few days to show up, got it on the bike, and it provided exactly the improvements I was expecting to see. The red line there is our bike as it sits on the dyno right now, with a Black Widow header installed, the Vance & Hines slip-on in place, and our custom ECU mapping with the fuel mapping optimized for the new airflow characteristics that these modifications provide. As you can see, we've gained torque literally everywhere, right off the bottom of 2,500 RPM, all the way to the limiter, with peak torque now coming up to 72 pound-feet. And we've gained a lot of horsepower pretty much everywhere after 4,000 RPM, to now a peak of 87.16 to the tire on pump gas. So while I was not surprised whatsoever to see the horsepower and torque gains from installing an aftermarket header on these bikes, especially because I've already spent quite a bit of time with this engine platform on the Africa Twin 1100's, I knew what we were going to see in terms of output changes. With an aftermarket header, I was surprised to see how much additional fuel it took to go ahead and get the AFRs on both cylinders back down into the low 13 range at wide open throttle when we added this header. There's some portions of the fuel mapping now where we are plus 45% over stock, folks. So if you're going to perform these sets of modifications, you absolutely cannot get away with doing it on the stock mapping. It might run but it is going to run very, very poorly, and at wide open throttle, the fuel mapping is downright dangerous with an aftermarket header installed on these bikes. So if you're gonna go through this level of modification where you're talking about replacing the slip-on and the header, you absolutely need to send the ECU to someone like us here at 2-Wheel Dyno Works that has developed proper exhaust-specific mapping for this setup. Now, luckily, while cruising, we're not having to see fuel trims quite that aggressive with both the header and the slip-on installed. There's some portions at light throttle that I'm plus 15 to maybe plus 20%, around like the 15 to 20% throttle range. It's not until you're really getting into the throttle, past 50% or so, where you're starting to see those significant value changes. So don't worry, if you decide to go ahead and do this level of modification to your Rebel 1100, you're not going to completely destroy your fuel economy. And I can tell you, having ridden the bike around as it sits right now quite a bit, that it feels nothing like it did when it rolled off the showroom floor. It feels so much smoother and stronger throughout the entire rev range now that it's really not something that the dyno graphs do justice, and you'll just have to feel and experience for yourself. Now, when you're tuning these bikes for any level of exhaust modification, there are a couple things that you need to do, and one thing that I'd recommend doing if you're going to have someone like us tune your bike with our custom ECU mapping service. Step one is ditch the O2 sensor. It has to come off. As I've mentioned in several videos recently on other new models that we've bought for tuning development, you simply cannot work around the garbage narrowband O2 sensors that come equipped on these bikes right out of the factory. The automotive industry these days is using very sophisticated, accurate, and fast wideband AFR sensors, and that is not what is in any modern motorcycle with the exception of some of the high-level BMWs. So for pretty much every bike out there with these garbage narrowbands in place, you have to get them out of the equation. So you'll see that in the instructions on our website, and the big note in bold there that if you've even got a slip-on installed on this bike, you gotta ditch the O2 sensor, or it will do nothing but interfere with the fueling that we have built for each of these setups. Now, the next system that I would really highly recommend addressing on these bikes with any level of aftermarket exhaust system is the air injection system. It's not a requirement, so to speak, but these things do pop quite a bit with the air injection system still in place with all the additional fuel that you have to add through a lot of the rev range on these bikes, and it just isn't honestly that great sounding in my personal opinion. I find it pretty obnoxious, and objectively it is actually not the greatest thing in the world for the exhaust valves and the packing and a nice muffler. So to address the air injection system on this bike is pretty straightforward because you can actually see it externally. If I get over here, the air injection port is right there on the cylinder head cover, and the hose goes straight up underneath the tank. All you've got to do to effectively disable the air injection system on these bikes is to go ahead and plug off that hose that you can see going into the port on top of the cylinder head cover. It's as simple as just grabbing a pair of long needle nose, popping the hose off, shoving a marble, a vacuum cap, whatever fits snugly in there to block off the airflow, pop it back on, and you're done. And no, folks, you are not going to get a check engine light by ditching the air injection system or plugging it off and unplugging the O2 sensors. We disable those fault codes in the ECU when we are flashing them. So regardless of what level of modification you're currently at, or you want to be in the future with your new Rebel 1100, head over to 2wheeldynoworks.com, purchase our mail-in ECU flashing service on our site for $349.99, follow the instructions there, ship it to us, and we'll get it flashed and shipped right back to you the very same day that we receive it. And for those of you looking for even more performance than just the slip-on and a header and our custom ECU mapping can provide, don't worry. I did not just buy a brand new motorcycle for tuning development to only build effectively 3 maps for it, stock, slip-on, and the Black Widow header. I am going to be going through a lot more modification with this thing and tailoring our custom fuel mapping for the additional modifications that we are going to make. I think there is some improvement to be had on the airbox side of things with these bikes, so we're going to be doing a lot of testing there, and obviously I'm going to be testing some different slip-ons, because like I said, I'm not a huge fan of the Vance and Hines, and I know a lot of folks like some of the shorter ones as well. Again, performance from one slip-on to another isn't likely going to change very much at all, but I'm still going to go ahead and tailor our custom fuel mapping for all those different combinations, which is why I can guarantee that you are just not going to find higher quality intake and exhaust specific custom ECU mapping for these bikes anywhere else than right here at 2-Wheel Dyno Works, because nobody else goes through the level of specific intake and exhaust R&D that we do here at this shop when we buy these bikes to develop our tuning for them. And if there is a specific system that you want to see on our bike and on the dyno, please do not hesitate to let me know via email, because while I'm already aware of a lot of the popular setups out here, like the Vance & Hines with the Black Widow header, and the Coffin slip-ons and the Cobra slip-ons, there could be something that I'm just not already aware of, and I'd love to hear about it from you guys, and unless it just looks like an exact knockoff of something I've already got on order, I'd be more than happy to buy it, put it on our bike, and test it here on our dyno. And for those of you looking to get your ECU flashed in your Rebel 1100, if you have any questions whatsoever, please do not hesitate to email us at support@2wheeldynoworks.com, because I personally answer any and all tech support questions every single day that we get while we're open here at the shop, and both myself and my staff are always happy to help get your bikes properly tuned and dialed in.